2, 3. Testing, testing. Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3. Testing, testing. I think we're good to go. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's lecture. Today's lecture is part of our husbandry course, and I titled it Better Intro to Dog Nutrition. Dog nutrition is really a big subject. So what this lecture is designed to do is to give you what I call a better introduction to dog nutrition. You could drive yourself crazy with dog nutrition. There's all kinds of opinions. There's all kinds of extremes out there when it comes to dog nutrition. And this lecture is designed to put together some of the basics that I believe a dog trainer should know in order to research further to make their own decisions, not only for themselves, but for also advising clients as well. And I feel like if you don't have a good base to start from, you don't necessarily even know where to look for further information. So I'm going to get started. And I like this subject because it's something that I have personally done a lot of research in myself. When I was working as a professional dog trainer and I was doing in-kennel jobs, for example, it is very important for me as a dog trainer, as it would be for you, to keep all of the dogs healthy. Not only my own dogs, but also client dogs, an environment where they're burning a lot of calories. I have to keep them healthy and alert. Also, I worked as a veterinary technician for quite a few years as well. And observing lots of dogs working as a veterinary technician and taking the history with pretty much every client of what their diet was and following illnesses. And also as a professional dog trainer, following my own clients, there were a lot of clients that I was able to work with their dogs from puppyhood until the dog became an old dog and passed away. So I feel like I have a lot of knowledge to bring to the table that I hope you keep an open mind, listen, and this information I believe will help you out. And feel free to ask any questions, especially at the end of the lecture. But if there's something important that you need to cut me off, I am monitoring the pack howl over here. So some of our learning objectives is we want to understand what humans fed dogs throughout history. I believe understanding some ethology to domestic dogs as it comes to nutrition is important. Gain some basic knowledge regarding canine nutrition. Understand the main different categories of dog food. Understand the basics of reading a dog food label, and understand the most important things to know when deciding on dog food. So first I want to start off with some ethology, basically, when it comes to dog food. Is dogs are, right, the domesticated version of the wolf. And wolves are, for the most part, I would say they're considered carnivores. They may be labeled omnivores in some places, but they are primarily eating meat, hunting and eating meat. However, they do eat, and there's lots of research, like during berry season, will eat lots of blueberries. They'll eat other things, and they will inarguably also eat the contents, especially of smaller animals, of their stomachs and things like that, like when they're eating rabbits and stuff, stuff like that. You'll also read things about how they don't eat stomach contents, and that's generally going to be with larger animals and ruminants These are the larger animals that usually have like 4-chamber stomachs, and they digest things a completely different way. So you're going to hear different things about wolves. But what's inarguable about dogs is, as we have domesticated them, is all research shows that not only did they physically evolve, that in order to adapt and to survive, some of their mechanisms to digest food, particularly grains, have also evolved so that they were able to basically eat what the humans ate that kept them. And I did put some links to some studies. There's something specifically called the Amy2B variant, which allows dogs to be able to digest starch much more efficiently than a wolf. Now, a wolf can digest starches to a degree, but with certain dogs, they can do it better, right? They can do it better. And it depends on a lot of factors. It depends on where they evolved in the world. You can read the study. And some dogs have more copies of these genes than others. In particular, the breeds of dogs in the old world, like in Europe, in Western Europe, and in Asia, in those areas, have more copies of these. And now remember, this is around studies. We have studies here that are pointing to, they were researching the bones and able to figure out what these dogs were eating, all during the time periods where we switched from hunter-gatherers to being farmers and cultivating food and domesticating different types of grains. So in these areas of the world, the dogs that have lived alongside humans, research shows that they mostly had diets of grains, believe it or not. But also, of course, they have never lost the ability to eat meats, and still their teeth still look pretty much like they're mostly meant to eat meat, but it's inarguable that they can digest grains, and that is really what dogs did eat for a lot with us. And I put some references to written history over here. Furthest back publication that I personally have is Cynogenicus, which is 431 BC, and I looked through there, and really the only reference I could see towards food, and it's about raising hunting dogs. He's talking about his puppies. Now, all this stuff's going to be pertinent to the rest of the lecture, is that he wrote, presently, when the puppies are strong enough to roam about, they should be given milk for a whole year, along with what will form their staple diet in the future, but nothing else. A heavy diet will distort the legs of a young dog, engender disease in other limbs, and the internal mechanisms will get out of order. So some things to keep in mind here is he's talking about a heavy diet. They were paying attention back then, knowing that the legs can get distorted and you can have problems by a poor diet, even back then. Cynogenicus was Greek, but over here this was a reference to, I'm gonna mess up the pronunciation, Marcus Terenius Varro. He wrote in a manual of farming that about feeding farm dogs was to feed them meat and bones and barley soaked in milk. All right. And here, 14th century over here, we have Count of Foy. I think I made a typo here. In South France, he wrote a book in which he was talking about how his greyhounds were to be cared for, and they were fed bran bread with some meat from the hunt. And if the dog got sick, goat's milk, bean broth, chopped meat, or buttered eggs. See, so there's a lot of protein over here. and there was bran bread soaked in milk. I looked in Dog Breaking, 1847. There was a few references over here, and it looks like all the references, yeah, were a starch with some sort of protein, oatmeal and Greaves. Interestingly, there's a reference over here to cornmeal, which we'll get to later, where, remember, corn is native to the New World. All the references that I find, which I think is important, old references are usually referring to things like barley and oats and stuff like that, rice, things that were domesticated in the old world. And here I saw, this was my first reference that I saw to Indian cornmeal. He was talking about how in America they were using cornmeal to help basically put on weight, to keep a very active dog. I found over here. And he's also talking about, I found a reference in this book about basically like lamb and rice sort of diet. Now let's see what he says. In India, I remember contemplating to an old sportsman that I had much difficulty in keeping my dogs free from mange. He once asked if I did not give them beef tea with their rice. I acknowledged that I did. He said it was of too heating of a nature. I tried mutton broth, agreeably to his recommendation. And the mange vanished. And now the dog may have had mange according to that, or sometimes I wonder if it was just a skin condition in general. But here we have like mutton with rice. Other old books over here that we have there's this one from 1890. This is in the knowledge base. In our knowledge base, you can look up house and pet dogs. I just took a screenshot of it. The whole book is there. There's selection, care, and training. The United States over here, 1890. When you look through here, the puppies, mostly dry bread with milk. It's mostly grains with some meat. Over here, Robert Tellman, 1914. Basically, you could read through this. He gives some details, but for an adult dog, it's what he's doing is he's given for a dog's, as a staple for the rest of a dog's life. He was suggesting a mixture of rice, vegetables, and lean meat on proportions of about 2 parts rice, 3 parts vegetables, and 1 part lean meat. Give also a large bone once or twice a week, always avoiding chicken bones, blah, blah, blah. All right. And water. So also, this is my last one over here, talking about history. I was flipping through an old book I have over here. This is not super, super old, but the New Standard Book of Dog Care and Training. And, this was written by Jeanette Cross and Blanche Saunders, who is really credited with making obedience popular in the United States. And this book was written in the 50s, I believe, 1952 was the first copy. And then there were other copies, like in the 60s. Now, Blanche Saunders, she was very, very, prolific, very involved with dog training, dog shows, obedience. She went to school for animal husbandry, and she was very, very experienced. And the book, reading through the nutrition sections of this, was very interesting because there's actually a lot to it, and there's all kinds of suggestions, a lot of versatility. And also going into the 50s over here, it's a lot of all these recipes. As before, there was a lot of commercial foods. Much of the food that was fed even then was starches with meat and vegetables. And she uses all different types of starches, all types of meat, all types of vegetables. Also, she talks about raw meat, that raw meat is really good for dogs, that you can give it. And when you look in old history books too, besides cooked meat, they are also given raw meat back then too. References to old Roman dogs of war. They were fed raw meat for extra, for extra strength and things like that. So there was lots and lots of versatility. Making dogs definitely omnivores. They were able to thrive. They were able to do well. In these old books, I'm finding references to 18-year-old dogs that are hunting, 13-year-old dogs. So we're not really doing anything in modern history that is completely taking the dogs to a new level as far as nutrition wise. We've been living with them for thousands and thousands of years. So now, next, you want to understand, if you want to understand dog nutrition, you do want to understand the basics of the nutrient groups. Now, these are the same for humans, but dogs utilize different ones. There's some differences of what's important, what's not as important to them. I'm not going to read through this word for word, but we have our macronutrients, we have our proteins and amino acids. And the proteins are going to be important for dogs, just like us, because they're going to actually build things. And dogs can get energy from it too. So it builds, repairs, they can get energy. We have fats and fatty acids. Compared to carbohydrates and proteins, fats pack per weight about twice as much energy in it versus proteins and carbohydrates. Matter of fact, sled dogs, like a lot of dogs in the Arctic, huskies and those things, they were in that part of the world, they were fed diets that were much higher in fats and lards and stuff like that because they were burning so much more energy. Matter of fact, the research also shows that the huskies as a whole have less copies of the genes that digest starches, mainly because they weren't being fed a lot of starches. And also in that area of the world, they were not really farming, right? They were eating what the humans ate, and the humans were mostly hunting. They were eating like marine mammals, fish, those sort of stuff. And things like huskies are going to reflect that. So ethology is going to be important here. Now, carbohydrates, dogs do not need carbohydrates for energy. It's not considered an essential nutrient in the way that proteins and fats actually are for them. However, dogs can get energy from the carbohydrates with less work than they can generally from protein. So it's considered like a protein saving molecule, which means if the dog, now you got to remember, if we have a domesticated dog and they're living with us as humans and we don't have an endless supply of meat to feed them, the energy that they can get from the carbohydrates saves the dog from using the energy from the protein, so they can use the protein to repair, build muscle, all that kind of stuff. All right. So they can get energy from carbohydrates, and they can use it to keep weight and things like that. One of the reasons why they were able to adapt to grains. And then we have the micronutrients. So the micronutrients are the things they're not really getting energy from, and they're in smaller amounts, but they need them for body function, for certain sorts of body functions. You have vitamins, which are mainly like organic, and we have all the different vitamins here. We have the fat soluble ones, we have the water soluble ones, very similar to, I'm not going to go through all of these, but these are all essential in the dog's diet. If they go without these for long enough, which is why I need to make sure it's in the food, they will develop problems, whether it's immune system problems, skin problems, problems with certain organs, problems with their bones. They will end up having problems. So we have our vitamins and we have our minerals, all right? The minerals differ from the vitamins mostly as in the minerals are not organic really. These are things like calcium, like things we could find like outside, but they need these for certain chemical processes, and they also need them to actually build even certain structures within the cells. And last but not least is, of course, water, where water is, it is a nutrient that they can go. That is the most important. I mean, they'll die quickest without water, basically. All right, and it's pretty self-explanatory. All right. Next, what you want to know is the different types of main categories of feeding. There is commercial, like the stuff that you find packaged, kind of like all in one, like in a bag or in a can. We have raw. We got home cooked. And I would say those are going to be our main categories. Now we're going to go into it. Now commercial is is definitely the most common right now in today's day and age, and is fairly new in modern history. You're going to have kibble, and you have canned, and you have sort of things in between, like semi-moist stuff and things like that. So I'm not going to go through all the bullet points here. However, I'm gonna go over some tips of how to pick and read the labels of the commercial food. The pros of the commercial food are that if you pick a good one, it's for the most part complete. You can feed commercial diet, and if it's a good one, it's going to have all the nutrients necessary to grow a puppy, keep it healthy into old age, and not have any diseases that are caused by nutritional deficiencies. And they can also be pretty affordable. Next is raw. Raw is what it is. It's feeding raw food. And raw is obviously with dogs started off eating, right? And in my experience, dogs can do really, really well eating raw if someone knows what they are doing. It goes back to the roots. I do believe, and I don't think there's any research that says otherwise, that dogs can be fed a raw, very natural diet, which does not involve any carbs or anything, any starches at all, similar to a wolf, and they can do fine. And you can find lots of testimonials about that. Because dogs, through domestication, their ability to eat, to get nutrients from starch is better than wolves. I believe it's kind of like an extra bonus that they have, but never taken away from their natural roots. I'm not saying there may not be individual dogs that for whatever reason may not be able to do well on it, but for the most part, raw food is accepted and common enough that it has gotten a surge in popularity, I would say over like the last 20 years. So the pros to it is you're going to get, if you know what you're doing, you could have some, really healthy dogs. You know exactly what you're feeding your dog, what you're putting in them. You generally don't have to feed as much volume. They have very small stools. There's lots of pros to it. The cons, if someone does not know what they're doing, you can have the dog can really get some bad deficiencies. And I've seen dogs that really got messed up on raw food, especially puppies, you know, for not having the right calcium-phosphorus ratios and stuff like that, if someone doesn't know what they're doing. The other con to it is it's raw food, and you have to be careful as a human handling raw meat and all of the bacteria that comes along with handling raw meat, especially if children are around and stuff like that. I know I've been sick before handling raw meat. Most people that feed raw diets have gotten sick at least once that I know of from not being super, super careful, even being careful, still getting sick from handling it. And the raw diets come in like, I would say there's two main ways that people do it. There's like a barf model, which is where people are given, you know, the dogs about 60 to 80% raw, meaty bones. That is bones with about 50% of meat on it, chicken necks, back, and wings, and 20 to 40% of fruit and vegetables, and then also meat, eggs, and dairy food. So they're using raw meat, but they're also putting vegetables and fruit and stuff like that. There's also a prey model diet, which completely doesn't use any vegetables at all. It's basically using about 5 to 10% organs, 10 to 15% edible bones, 80 to 85% muscle meat. And I put some like baseline recommendations of approximately what people feed per body weight when these do these, but you want to research them further if you do it. The last is home cooked. Home cooked is what it is. It's home cooked. This is anything from preparing carefully food that is cooked in the right proportions for your dog. I will also include kind of table scraps inside of here. So with home cooked, you have the same concerns as with raw food. We have obviously been doing this. Home cooked is what humans have been. This is probably what we can say mostly represents what we've been doing for dogs for thousands of years, along with throwing them raw meat and stuff like that. The idea is you gotta know what you're doing. So which one is the best? The best is a big giant depends. It's going to depend on the individual dog, the environment, and the capability of the owner. There are pros and cons to each one. For sure, I would say the safest is the commercial diet, where if you choose a commercial diet and it's working for the dog, you almost cannot go wrong if the dog's not having any sort of allergies or bad side effects. However, if you're very good at raw and home cooked, you could usually enjoy the benefit of knowing exactly what you're putting into your dog, and usually smaller stool volume with the raw in particular. Again, if you know what you're doing. And you can sort of do a combination of everything, which is what I basically do. You want to avoid going into becoming like polarized with dog food. You'll see veterinarians, like I know one client that I've had who's scared to tell their veterinarian that they feed raw food because the veterinarian will literally like scold and belittle them. But meanwhile, the client has tried every sort of commercial diet that she could, and the dog was not doing well. And then she did try the raw, actually based on Judy's recommendation to them, and the dog is doing fine on the raw, but she can't tell her own veterinarian about it, right? So everything is a case by case. So there are no studies. This I can tell you. There are no studies at all. We've been now doing, especially since raw has been around, because I was big on a raw kick for a while. But now raw has been, yeah, raw. I was actually introduced to raw when I first started training, actually. I don't know how long ago, almost like, um, you know, almost 30 years ago. I went to a client's house and they lived on a boat, so they were kind of eccentric. And I remember they had an Irish Terrier, and I saw them throw it a raw chicken wing, which to me was like, you're not supposed to get chicken bones. And it ate the chicken wing, and then they showed me a book. You know, give a dog a bone by who wrote it. I think it was Australian author or New Zealand author, and that was my first introduction to it. And it's been around for a while. And what I can say is there's no there's no studies that prove commercial diet versus raw diet versus home cooked that any diet significantly in the long run is going to like change the lifespan of your dog. So that's kind of a good thing. It takes some of the weight off of our shoulders that you don't have to feel stressed out dealing with clients. You know, like when you know something a client should be doing, if you haven't seen client yet, and it just kills you that you're not doing it. Feeding their dog is not one of those things. Like, let them have choices. I'll tell you what's going to be important. It's not so much about a polarized type of food that they're feeding the dog. There's certain things that are important here. And I'm going to go backwards a little bit here. The oldest confirmed dogs also ate just completely varied diets. So you're not going to find the oldest confirmed, like Bobby, that last one that died recently, 31 years old. It was like a Portuguese Mastiff. He basically ate what the owners ate. That's what they said. They just soaked whatever they ate in water to remove any spices. And that was his primary diet. He lived on a farm and he ate cooked food, which I'm sure consisted of probably vegetable starches and meat. Exactly what dogs have been eating, for thousands of years with us, is those combinations of particular things, but also lived a comfortable lifestyle, it sounded like. And it was probably quality food. Bluey, that was the Australian cattle dog from Australia, lived like 29 years, 5 months. That one, you're going to see different things, but everything I could read, it was varied. Kangaroo, emu, table scraps, and some commercial food I saw. It wasn't on any specific diet. It had a varied diet and was well taken care of. But it sounded like it was fairly quality food. There's this other one, Bramble, of 27 years, like a border collie, I think it was in the UK somewhere. They claimed, you have to take claims with the, grain of salt about everything, because this dog I know was like adopted. I don't know how long this owner had it, but she claimed it was a vegetarian. But still, it just goes to show you don't have to be too stressed out about things. This dog ate supposedly mostly rice, lentils for the protein, and vegetables. Although I just doing a little search online, I heard the reports that it might have ate some eggs. And it was also unknown what the diet was before she adopted the dog. So, could the dog have grown to like an adult where it's even more important that they're fed the right diet when they're actually growing. They're a little bit more resilient. Dogs are more resilient once they're fully grown. So again, there's varied things. These are things that I found important. Now, this is my experience. All my experience with dogs. I have owned lots of dogs. I have watched hundreds of clients' dogs from puppies to adulthood. I have seen dogs where I was like, I don't think this is going to go well based on what they're eating, and then it didn't go well. I've also known lots of dogs like this is going to go well, and of course it did go well. This is based off experience with my own dogs and stuff like that. And also dealing with my students in the career school. Remember, I teach and I'm certified to teach this in an animal science career school. This is what I think to sort of go through, wade through the confusion, the least you really need to know about getting started with making good choices with feeding dogs is number one is weight. Is no matter what you're feeding the dog, you want to have the right amount of calories, basically. There is a link over here, which is to just another thing on the site here. If you don't know how to know what a good weight is, there is a little bit of a video over here. But this is something for sure that there is research that shows this. And there's references going all the way back to Cynogeticus about with the puppies. Is if you want to have a healthy dog, is number one, is don't let the dog get overweight, especially while they're growing. It messes up their joints. They have problems for life. It is always better to have a dog look almost a little too skinny than a little too overweight. And when I first became a trainer, I was working for an importer that was bringing in German Shepherds for the Department of Defense, and we had to train them. And it didn't matter how well you train that dog. If its hips and its health and elbows were not perfect, the dog was going to get returned. It was a huge waste of investment. Keeping the dog lean is going to be important. Next, I cannot stress this enough. This is so overlooked. It's the most overlooked thing in dog nutrition is the calcium-phosphorus ratio. You have to have the right calcium-phosphorus ratio, which is roughly about 1.2 to 1.4 calcium to 1 part phosphorus. The ratio can range as high. You hear things, some say up to 2 parts calcium to 1 part phosphorus, but it should never drop below 1 part calcium to 1 part phosphorus. And don't worry, a lot of if you do commercial dog food, it has it on the labels. There's other ways that you can find it. This is one of the reasons why raw and home cooked, you have to be very careful. And where I've seen, which is why I'm very, very careful raising a puppy with raw, is you could cause major problems. For example, this is so common. Puppies, giving them too much calcium. You see people with German Shepherds and stuff like that, and they'll buy this calcium supplement and add extra calcium, or give them too much bone when they're feeding them raw and thinking they're doing a good thing. It is not a good thing. It throws off the balance. And then what happens is basically you know, in a nutshell, when you eat calcium, you can have like free calcium floating around like in the blood. And there's also, the body also can like absorb calcium, like release calcium from the bones, reabsorb calcium. It needs the phosphorus in order to do this. When you have too much calcium, what happens is it deposits in areas where it's not supposed to be, and it thickens and makes weird formations on the bone that makes bones brittle. You get these German Shepherds and they do their hip x-rays. The breeder thought they were doing a good thing by giving them extra calcium. Instead, they warped the joints by making these big extra growths inside of them. They mess up the spine by making extra growths in the spinal column, mess up the dog's back, cause all kinds of problems, which can last the lifetime of the animal at that part. So especially important when the dog is growing. I recognized even when I was feeding raw to older dogs in my kennel, I would feed raw, and I noticed if I was feeding too much bone, like too much, if I was feeding chicken quarters that has a high bone to meat ratio compared to say giving like chicken thighs, like what we give our dogs mostly here if we do raws. We usually do like a chicken thigh, which is a lot of meat, one bone, and then we might be given some stuff like gizzards or something like that, having more meat per bone. If I gave too much bone, even with an older dog, they would start stiffening up. You got to be very, very careful. You need to understand this. If you don't know that this is a big problem, you could potentially have a problem. So you got to know to research this. And then you can have a ratio that's too low. So this could be, like, again, big problem with people feeding raw. Like, oh, I'm feeding raw. I've seen breeders selling their puppies for a lot of money and being like, oh, look, we feed our puppies raw, so good. And they're given like buckets of like meat. And some of it looks really good, all right, of meat, but not enough bone. And then what happens is these German Shepherds, everything's floppy. They're literally like, they're literally having like a plantigrade gait, it's called. That's like when the pasterns, like when you see like a puppy, like their wrist is like on the ground and they're walking like on the ground and their hocks are hitting the ground. All kinds of crazy stuff because they don't have the calcium to support the bones, and they can have anxiety, having all kinds of issues. It can also happen if someone is feeding a balanced commercial dog food and then just decide to throw a bunch of like hamburger meat or something on top of it. And be like, oh, this is going to help the dog. Instead, they just threw off the calcium-phosphorus ratio, because when you have too much phosphorus, the calcium can't necessarily go to where it's supposed to be, all right? There is definitely a balance. So, of course, you need the right amount of calcium, but it also has to be in the right ratio with the phosphorus. You need to know about this. Let's see. Next. Well, we're going to go into, AFCO statement. I'm going to go into that, reading dog food labels. In commercial dog food, if you do get commercial dog food, there's always a statement by AFCO. And you need to, especially with a puppy, but it's safe to do this with all dogs, is you want to look for an all life stages rating. That's mostly means, besides having, all the right nutrients for all life stages, what's very, very important is the calcium phosphorus ratio is going to be correct, which you're not going to get that all the time if it's just labeled for like maintenance or something like that. You have to look for the all life stages label in the AFCO statement. And it's not there, all right? It's not there in a lot of dog food. So please be aware of that, all right? Ken says, looking like a show dog with low rider hips and goose stepping. Yeah, and remember, some dogs, it's normal to have high angulation. Now, there's a difference between, that's a good point, like American show line German Shepherds are often very, very highly angulated, but you're going to get like Doberman Pinschers. I've seen puppies that are supposed to not be like that at all, right? Like really straight and are flopped over, walking on their pasterns, basically. Things like that. I've actually seen it from a lot of good breeders, where it was obviously not the right, whatever they were doing, they were not given the right calcium phosphorus ratio. That can also happen from a puppy being like crated too much and things like that. But often diet is a big part too. But these are weight, calcium phosphorus ratio. Next is joint nutrition for all dogs. If you're doing something like a raw, you need to make sure that they are getting sources of glucosamine, chondroitin, MSM, which you're going to find this Most you're going to get the glucosamine and chondroitin mostly inside of cartilage, things that has cartilage, like cartilage of bones, tracheas, things like that. If you are doing a commercial diet, and I would say even with home cooked diets, because you're not as likely to be given cartilage, you have to give a good supplement. I'm saying have to. I'm saying have to if you want to see the full potential of your dog. All right. You may have it. I'm not just talking about a dog living a decent lifespan, if nothing else genetic pops up. I'm talking about being as agile as possible. So you want to be able to find a good supplement that has glucosamine, chondroitin, and MSM at the very least in it. And I can only talk through my experience. The two that I've used is Glycoflex 3 and also Agility, which I get through the Life's Abundance company. Both of those I know for sure have worked on lots and lots of dogs. And to give you an example, and I compare, and I'm always comparing other dogs I know that have not been on joint supplements compared to ones that I know. All right. So, for example, my own, I'm a German Shepherd person. I've bred a few litters. I only bred 3 litters, right? 3 litters. But for German Shepherds, raising them that way and coaching people to do it in 3 litters, I have never had significant joint problems with any of the German Shepherds in 3 litters. Matter of fact, even Orfeo, who did hurt his back, which was from trauma, it wasn't from anything with the diet, which happened like a year and a half ago, which trauma to his back, and he's 11 years old now. He's not perfect, but I think because he's on these supplements and everything, he's basically been able to recover actually pretty well. And get an x-rayed when we were checking him during that time. It was, I guess, 10 at the time. His hips were still basically perfect for like a 90-pound German Shepherd at like 10 at 10 years old. My 14-year-old Shih Tzu mix at 14 can still run and jump up onto the couch, still jump up onto the tabletop. No one, I pretend that she's not my dog when she does that, and jump off. She's on joint supplements, right? My dogs, whatever. Yuri, I've always had dogs that have always been very, very, very agile, no uncomfortable problems. And I started this way back when I was like 20. I was in college when I discovered it with my 15-year-old German Shepherd Lab mix. Before I had her on the joint supplements at like 12 years old, she had trouble going upstairs. By the time she was 15, she was able to jump up on top of things just from making sure she stayed on the joint supplements. The thing is with joint supplements is what they do is they rebuild. You got to think of the joints. There's cartilage in there and it breaks down. The cartilage breaks down. There's wear and tear, but the nutrients you need, the good thing is that stuff could replenish and repair, but the nutrients you need from that, you need to seek it out. It's just not enough quantities in commercial dog food. You can get it in raw if you're feeding the right things inside of raw. Commercial dog food, or if you're feeding, in my experience, you really have to give them extra. It keeps everything lubed in there and it repairs just as quick as it breaks down. If you're not giving enough, it breaks down quicker than it builds back up. So so you definitely want to have them on a good joint supplement. And next, quality ingredients. It does not matter what type you do. If it's balanced, you have to make sure it is quality ingredients. It's basically quality ingredients. There is commercial dog food where you can look at the ingredients and sometimes you don't even know what it is, all right? It might say meat meal, but you don't know what kind of meat. Or if you do research about the company, the sources are just terrible, All right. That's one of the cons about commercial dog food. But if you're cooking, you're doing raw, you have to have quality ingredients, and you have to confirm that all these nutrients that are listed, that they are getting them all in the right quantity. All right. If you're doing commercial food, we do have, we do have AFCO that helps ensure that you have the right percentages of everything. If you're cooking yourself or doing raw, you want to go a step further than this lecture and learn more about making sure that it is balanced. I do have also, there's a link over here. It's an article I copied from the FDA that you can check out about reading dog labels, dog food labels, which helps know some of the tricks of marketing with it. For example, the product names. You need to know, and you could also coach your clients, all right? There's things like, you want to know the 95% rule. You really don't find a lot of dog food that's going to say like beef for dogs or tuna cat food. If it just says like a meat and cat food, like dog food, like chicken dog food, you don't see that because it would have to be at least 95% that. The FDA protects you with that. When you see something like dinner, I would say this is mostly common like in cat food, like chicken dinner, it just means there has to be 25% of it. And it goes down with. So if you hear a dog food or a cat food, something with salmon or with this or with that, it just means 3%. If it says flavor, there doesn't have to be any percentage required. It just has to be detectable somehow. All right. And so you don't really, so you want to be able to really know that. The other thing we're going to go into is the ingredient list. Knowing the ingredient list, there's some things that you want to know, which is number one. This is the same thing with human food labels, is the heaviest ingredients go first, and then you work your way down from there. But the dog food companies really help, kind of like manipulate that, which I'm going to go into in a moment over here. But commercial dog foods have to have guaranteed analysis. And like I said, you can look, make sure all the vitamins and everything are there. But in reality, the most important thing is the least you need to know is the AFCO statement, because you want to really be able to know the AFCO statement, and it's going to help you out a lot to know at least you have a decent balance over there. See what you guys are saying over here. We have, Ken says he uses Cosequin Max strength in most of my dogs. I had to find a food that is yeast free because my German Shepherds were getting crusty noses. After I found one, it went away. Yeah, so with dog foods, here's the thing. It's they're different. I have like my own theories. There's no studies on it. These are some things that I've noticed is I noticed if you're feeding starches in diet, I believe most of the starches from the old world that the dogs have been eating with humans, especially if they're European, Euro-Asian sort of dogs, is they seem to do well on things like rice and oats and things like that. I have personally noticed that dogs do not do as well with the New World grain, corn. That's my personal experience. My theory is because they were not eating corn for thousands of years. They were eating the grains that were domesticated in Europe and Asia. However, remember, there are a few dog, breeds that are New World dogs, like Chihuahuas and things like that. And I've known, and some dogs obviously do well on corn-based diet. But you want to consider that. Like, you want to consider the individual dog. Is do not ever like vilify broad sweeps of things. Like for example, do not marketing grain-free. I'm jumping around here. Grain-free marketing is bad. It's very deceptive because they say dogs are not meant to eat grains. Of course, dogs eat grains. You know, you wouldn't have dogs if it wasn't for the fact that they could eat grains. They would have died out. They had to adapt in order to eat grains, and they do eat grains, and it's fine. So it's often, you know, it's deceptive. They've been eating grains for thousands of years, and then what they do is in grain-free. What is more true is that some grains dogs don't do good on. And in my opinion, it's in my experience, the grains that dogs have not done as well on, mostly like skin issues, have been corn and actually wheat. But I haven't had a lot of issues with the other ones. Now, grain-free diets, they're mostly replacing the grains with just other plant-based proteins that, in my opinion, have not really been traditionally used. And even in some of my literature, some of the old authors say to avoid it, which has been like beans. You know, they just replace the grains with like beans, you know, lentils or peas and things like that. Because when you have a dry food, you need a starch. You can't have dry kibble without some kind of starch. If it was pure meat, it would just look like dirt. So they have to have a starch. And it's just a marketing thing. You know, they're not like, oh, we want to give the dog what the wolves are eating. They just replace the gains with peas, which is something else that obviously some dogs are able to do fine on it. But it's just because it's not a grain. It's just like a marketing thing. So it could be a little bit deceptive. So I never worry about the grain-free marketing. Matter of fact, because I don't trust like peas and stuff as much as a grain that the dog is not doing problems on, because they also get a lot of protein from the peas, is I usually stay away from the grain-free stuff. So yeah, focus on the type, grain, ethology rather than just the label grains. If you have a dog, especially a lot of the European dogs, a lot of them do fine on grains, live a long time, have no allergies, don't have any problems, all right? The other thing is going to be ingredient splitting. Ingredient splitting is where they take similar ingredients that can look like it takes similar ingredients and do a lot of them, so it looks like a lot in small quantities, so it looks like there's more of that type of ingredient. I'll give you an example. There's two ways they use ingredient splitting. One is, suppose you get a bag of dog food and it says it has chicken, turkey, veal, fish, a bunch of different types of meat are listed on there. And you grab another bag of dog food and it just says lamb and then other ingredients. Sometimes you'll have, actually often, this much lamb, but then these smaller amounts of the other meat-based proteins in the other bag, and you'll think you're getting more meat, but it's just lesser amounts of a lot of them, right? It's kind of like getting a sandwich, right? You get like a big roast beef sandwich, or you could get like an Italian combo that has a bunch of different, meats on it, but it's the same size sandwich, okay? The other thing you do about ingredient splitting is if they want to move an ingredient down the ingredient list so that it doesn't look like there's as much of it. For example, for the most part, all dried dog food has a lot of starch in it to hold it together. But most dog food companies, they're going to take, instead of just using one starch, they're going to use multiple starches So this way, none of them weigh that much. So they could push it down further on the list, even though it might be the same amount in another type of dog food. So I'm going to go down. I'm going to go right to some examples over here because I think the best way to talk about this is to go, these are some old, I don't even know if this is the recipe of these. I took these, because I had these in the old 3.1 course, and I just kind of cut and paste these over here as an example. Let's look at a few different types of food. Here goes Hill Science Diet. I think they changed the formula since then. I'm not sure what they have in here right now. I think they took out the corn, so it's like grain-free for marketing. I don't know if you could see that. I think I'll make this a little bigger here. Oh, I made it too big. Can't see it. Okay, so let's say we're talking about dry dog food over here. Hill Science Diet. When you see, I'm going to talk about a plain meat listed, like chicken, versus a meal listed, like chicken meal. When you have chicken versus chicken meal, it all comes out the same after it's cooked. The difference is chicken, before it is cooked, it has its moisture still in it, which is about 75% moisture. Makes it about 70, that much heavier. So it allows, if you see just chicken, that means it was weighed before it was dehydrated and put into the ingredient bin. If you see chicken meal, that means it's already been dehydrated and it weighs less before they weigh it. So often when you see like chicken as the first ingredient, and then right here, this is classic ingredient splitting. We have whole grain wheat, cracked pearled barley, whole grain sorghum, whole grain corn, corn gluten meal. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These are 5 starches. All right, split. Pretty much all serving the same purpose for the most part. You know, it's gonna boost these all, especially corn has protein in it. So they're gonna get a lot of their protein content from the corn, and they're gonna get, you know, and it's gonna be a starch. So in reality, with the Hill Science Diet, if you put this all on the table, it's mostly gonna be probably getting most of their protein and stuff from corn. And then there's less chicken. Then over here, when you're looking at a label, it says pork fat. The bulk of what the dog food is, once you get to the fat source, that's the bulk of the diet. Then after that, it becomes much less, and it's a lot of like the vitamins and stuff like that, things in smaller amounts. So what we have here is, if you read this, the Hill Science Diet, it's a mixture of a bunch of different grains and chicken, which is why it's probably, if some dogs don't do good on that, because if they have an issue with any one, with wheat or corn, they're both in there and it's split up, they may have an issue with this, right? Something like this, here goes pedigree, which popular at Walmart. They come in these big giant bags. This is an example of a company that they don't seem to be marketing, right? Science Diet, they're marketing these to like veterinarians and things like that. They want to make it look like, oh, look, this is mostly chicken. It's really not. Then over here, pedigree, they're just marketing to whoever wants to buy a cheap bag of food, right? These come in like big giant bags. The food itself is usually pumped with a lot of air, so you could fit, it looks like a lot more is in the bag. But here they didn't do ingredient splitting. It's whole grain corn, all right? There's nothing, they didn't split. So this is mostly, even though it's probably about the same amount of starch as what's in the Science Diet, they didn't do ingredient splitting. Next, it's meat and bone meal. So this is their meat source. But talk about quality. If you see something like meat and bone meal, you don't even know what kind of meat that is, whatever the lowest bidder was. So if you call the pedigree company and say, what kind of meat is in this bag, they can't tell you. Right? Look at the labels, right? And then corn gluten meal. This is probably where a lot more of the protein is coming from. And then here, the fat source is animal fat. Again, you don't even know what kind of animal that is. It could be a mixture of all different types of animals. But this bag of food is going to be very cheap. But this is where you may have health issues, allergies, diarrhea. It might be different in every type of bag. This would be like very, very low quality, but you can see there's no ingredient splitting over here. It's pretty much straightforward. Here's one that I would say is known as a fairly good quality food, but lots of ingredient splitting here. So let's see, this is Origin Original. I say this is a few years old, so it may be a different formula now. This is lots of ingredient splitting for the meat. So it's not listed as a meal, so the water content is in it, so they could push it up front. But we have deboned chicken without the water removed, right, before it's cooked. Deboned chicken, deboned turkey, yellowtail flounder, whole eggs, mackerel, chicken liver, turkey liver, chicken heart, turkey heart, herring. Now, instead of deboned chicken, dehydrated chicken, right? Same ingredient, but now it's just dehydrated. Dehydrated turkey, same one, just this one's dehydrated. Dehydrated mackerel, the same ingredient. It's basically the same ingredient. One, they dehydrated it before they put it in the bin. The other one's going to get dehydrated anyway once they cook it. So I don't know how many, I don't know. There's like a dozen things over here. This is massive ingredient splitting. It looks like there's lots of meat, but in reality, it's about the same amount of meat you're going to find in almost any dry food, really. And then over here, it's probably called the grain-free. There's no grains, but they have whole, once we get over here, we have whole green peas, navy beans, red lentils, pinto beans, chickpeas, green lentils, lentil fibers. So there's a bunch of beans. So the beans in the Origin, they probably say that's grain-free, but what they did is they put the beans in there, and the beans help also as a starch, holds it together. And of course, there's protein in beans. And I'm not saying whether it's good or bad. It's just be aware that that's what it is. Like that's what you're looking at, that you can make a judgment. And some dogs apparently do fine on this, all right? But once you get to the main fat source right here, it says chicken fat. This right here represents basically the same bulk, the same amount. This is the bulk of the food up to the chicken fat. Then we get smaller amounts of things, chicken flavor, heron oil, some other things over here, which is mostly going to be adding, vitamins and minerals and things like this. Canada. Lamb meal. So this is the lamb dehydrated already as a meal. And it's still in the front. Brown rice, cracked pearl barley, rice bran. So we have some grains, and then they put peas. This is probably increased the protein, but they use canola oil over here. That's the fat source, canola oil. From what I understand, chicken fat is normally considered a better fat for the dogs. But if a dog has like a chicken allergy, which is common, you'll often see canola oil replaced as the fat source, and that's probably what this one is more, for like a lamb and rice formula, they probably called it, although it's not a true lamb and rice because you're seeing like peas and stuff in there. But that looks like the only animal protein source that we see in here. Life's Abundance. This is what I feed my dogs. And the reason why I choose this isn't really like a plug. I mean, I guess it sort of is because I only say things that help. Is I use Life's Abundance because it checked all the boxes for me. Now I'm saying there's definitely dogs that probably do fine on all this stuff. The reason why I did Life's Abundance, why I mostly fed that as a staple, but I rotate with other things, is it was pretty, I kind of felt like it was pretty straightforward. I knew what was in it. There wasn't really any ingredient splitting. There was just chicken meal dehydrated. There's ground brown rice and oats, which is old school. These are old school grains that basically rice and like oatmeal or a form of it, same plant, where I've never really had any issues with it. And then chicken fat. So this is not about chicken. Like this is about the same amount of food from here. Here's the fat source. If you take something like Origin, they have like 1 million ingredients before the fat source, but it's really about the same, probably about the same amount of like meat, maybe even more meat in the Life's Abundance because they're not using peas as a protein booster. And they just split up two different starches. My guess, if they used one starch, I think this is true of all dry food, it would probably, if they just use rice or oat groats, it would probably be oat groats or rice first, then chicken meal. But I believe that's probably true for most dog foods. Now, next thing you want to know is, for price-wise, is know how to evaluate a bit about how much calories are in the food that you're feeding. It is good if you want to have smaller poop, be able to feed less bulk, which is safer for the dogs. We'll go over things like bloat in other lectures. Is I always look for what I don't have to feed as much of. Now, there's two things that you'll see on bags of dog food. One is the calories, says kilocalories, which is the same thing as a calorie per kilogram in the bag, which means if you take a kilogram of that food, how many calories are in it? I personally think, well, it makes sense that this is the best way to determine if you're getting the best bang for your buck, is how many calories are in a kilogram. If you determine how many calories are in a kilogram, you know you could compare foods directly and to know for the same weight of food, which do I have to feed less of, all right, for the dog to get the calories that I need. If not, if you have like 2 bags of food that are both 30 pounds, and one of them is 4,000 calories a kilogram and one is 3,000 calories a kilogram, and everything else is equal to price-wise, obviously you're going to be going through more food to keep the weight. With something with less calories a kilogram, you have to also combine that with your knowledge of the quality of the calories, all right? If you feel the calories are coming from a food source that you don't really like, you look at the label. Next thing you look at, the other thing to look at is calories per cup. Calories per cup are different than the calories of kilogram because kibble has different shape, different amounts of air pumped into it. So for example, like with the Life's Abundance, I don't like to have a lot of bulk in the food. It's usually small, flat kibble. So per cup, there's about 450 calories in a cup. So I suggest having more dense calories in the measuring cup. It shows how much food you're putting into the dog's system versus some things like pedigree, even if it might be somewhat similar calories per kilogram. And even if you don't mind getting the calories mostly from corn versus like a meat, because they make the kibble big and round and full of air, you're often going to also have to put a lot more in the bowl, which then you're feeding to the dog, and a lot of that bulk is also inside of the stomach of the dog. So these are things to consider when you're looking at the food. And always remember to look at the AFCO statement. And let's see, how am I doing on time here? Okay, so I'm going to wrap up this particular lecture. I'm going to see if I have any questions over here. I like to keep these lectures not too long. Obviously, this is a huge subject, but I feel if you read this page and listen to this lecture, it gives you a base to do further research and be able to make better decisions and not be, what's the word? Easily, marketing could really get you, all right? And some trainers, like I said, will really get into the raw to the point where they're trying to convince all their clients to do raw, which I do not think is a good idea, although it can be a good idea for certain situations. Just like it's not necessarily a good idea if you have a client and the dog is doing fine on raw to then necessarily to tell them to go like on a kibble, right? You want to know that what's important, right? Make sure you know what's important. And we could go into reading labels and everything all day long. We could spend days, hours, weeks. You could take full nutrition courses. There's full courses just on dog food out there. But hopefully this gives you an overview here. Let me see what we have over here. Ken, looks like Ken has a lot of comments over here. Let's see what we have over here. Commercially farmed, raised salmon and fed food that has yeast in it. Corn is garbage. I see lots of comments. You can go. Yeah, it's lots of comments on lot of the ingredients. A lot of the ingredients over here. Yes, and neutered and spayed dogs. Yeah, every dog requires different calorie requirements. So you want to read the labels and you want to watch your dog. And that's what I suggest is don't ever just like, what's good for one dog is not good for the next dog, all right? Is you have to watch your dogs. As a dog trainer, I'm a fan of life's abundance, right? And but I do not in no way do I think that's the only food a dog could do good at. That's just what I chose for me when I had in kennel, and what worked for the most dogs, the most clients with puppies, breeding dogs, that I had the least amount of problems with. The biggest problem I had with that is occasionally I would have a dog that had a chicken allergy, and then I would just switch them to a different food. But at least I knew everything else was in there, and the company's very transparent, no recalls, they get their food sourced good, and I can also, as a dog trainer, my clients could buy it from me, make some extra money from it, and I was fine with that. But my own dogs, even though we feed Life's Abundance, we also rotate raw sometimes. We also go and get some other brands of food sometimes just to make sure that their gut is not used to one thing. My old Shih Tzu mix, she was mostly raised on that, and as she get older, now she's on canned food. She eats lots of table scraps. There's like I said, you have to have a good overview so you can even begin making the decisions. But I could tell you, if anyone says this is the best one, like be very, very cautious. All right, if they say one type of feeding is the best, it is not proven. It is just simply not proven that one is better than the other at all. So I'm gonna wrap this up. I don't think I have any more. I don't think I have any questions over here. I will be back on Saturday with Q&A. Thanks for everyone's